Today's show is in observance of Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and January 11th is Human Trafficking Awareness Day. And today's guest we have from the FBI El Paso's field office, two of El Paso's agents, Supervisory Special Agent Aida Reyes, who is over the FBI El Paso's Crimes Against Children and Human Trafficking, and Special Agent Valerie Venegas, the Behavioral Analysis Unit Coordinator. Ladies, welcome to Midlife MOCHA podcast. So if you don't mind, if you can start by introducing yourselves.
Yes, thank you. My name is Aida Reyes, and like you mentioned, I oversee the squad that works violations to include crimes against children and human trafficking matters.
And Ms. Venegas.
Yes, hello. First of all, thank you so much for having us. Yes, I'm Special Agent Valerie Venegas here in the El Paso field office. One of my many jobs, aside from being just regular special agent, is also being the behavioral analysis coordinator here for the El Paso field office, which means that I am the bridge between the field and our behavioral analysis unit back at Quantico.
I know this topic isn't great for everyone, but I know that the community definitely needs to be aware of it. I think some of us aren't too dated or educated about what we can do when it comes to human trafficking. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But I'd like to know if you can tell us a little bit about or the definition of human trafficking and how it's different from human smuggling.
Sure, I can address that. So human trafficking has two components. It has a sex trafficking component and a labor trafficking aspect. So it can affect anyone, really, U.S. persons and non-U.S. persons of any age, of any gender, that are compelled or to engage in either commercial sex acts or labor trafficking by either force, fraud, or coercion. So it's forced labor. Domestic human modern day slavery is commonly what it's known as. And the way that it differs from human smuggling, it's a little bit different, because human smuggling, it's an immigration issue. That's when an individual normally, agrees to pay an amount to be immigrated or transported to a different country. So it involves travel. It's really a crime against a border. There's always a border involved. So that's a basic differentiation between human trafficking and human smuggling.
So what are the various types of human trafficking and which is more prevalent in our area?
Well, what we see in our area is we do have a lot of folks that are recruited in the El Paso area. And what I've seen here is primarily sex trafficking. Normally, individuals are recruited here and then they're taken to other larger cities such as Houston, Chicago area. So that I would say sex trafficking is the most prevalent in the El Paso area.
Do you have current statistics regarding human trafficking? And I guess we probably are talking a little bit more about El Paso, but you may have an overall broad view when it comes to Texas and maybe the region. Who are the victims?
Well, the victims can be really anyone. We've seen anyone from really young girls under 18. We've also seen younger women, which are in their 20s. But for the most part, they appear to be, at least for sex trafficking, females of any race and of any age. Usually the younger girls or younger women are the ones that are recruited into this type of crime.
I think one of the big misnomers is with respect to human trafficking, especially in our area, is the presumption that they always have to come from another country. And so what people find interesting and are shocked to find out is that many of the victims are actually local victims. They're actually from El Paso. They're going to our middle schools and our high schools. They're not necessarily what you see in the movies. If you've seen the movies, Taken, for example, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. I forget how many there are now, but that's the idea. And that's sort of the image that people have when they talk about human trafficking. And what people don't realize is that a lot of our victims are actually local, our neighborhood girl next door, boy next door. And so that's why it's very important for our community to know what human trafficking is and the fact that it is something that happens in our own backyard.
In El Paso, are there any open cases? Are there any recoveries?
We do have some open investigations. Fortunately, since they're open, I can't go into detail about those specifically, but I would say percentage wise, it's about 20 to 25% of our caseload with those type of human trafficking investigative matters. And as far as yes, identified folks, victims that are identified and located, we do have a high percentage of those individuals that are identified or located. Unfortunately, with human trafficking, sometimes these victims are folks that are runaways, or so we, even though they are located and identified, sometimes they go back to the same thing that they know, and it's just a matter of whoever spots them kind of recruits them and exploits their vulnerabilities, whatever those vulnerabilities may be.
Well, now, I know it's been said that El Paso is a gateway for trafficking. Why is this a significant fact? Does it have to do with just because we're on the border? Are there other
Well, I think
reasons?
I think just I-10, that corridor that goes, through different states, that plays a large role into El Paso being a gateway for this type of crime.
I know I've been, during the holidays, I did a lot of binge watching on Netflix, and for some reason, I found myself watching a lot of the shows. Most of it was related to like drug trafficking and things like that, but I noticed that it may have a similar pattern, that there was always a business involved, or a business being used for some of those things. So are there businesses that are usually involved when it comes to human trafficking, or is that an issue?
Yeah, there's definitely, businesses that are more vulnerable. Of course, you're going to see that more in hotels or massage parlors, you know, businesses that have a tendency to lend themselves to that type of service, I guess. Restaurants are also a common place for labor trafficking, not necessarily for sex trafficking. Casinos are another place where it's common to find this type of criminal activity going on.
And I know some of my other thoughts probably have more to do with the behavioral part, which I know we'll get a little bit more into. So I don't want to seem all over the place, but I know some of those questions can't be answered, in one day. When it comes to the investigative side, what are the legal stipulations when it comes to those who participate in human trafficking, and are they significantly different based on one's type of participation?
Well, a lot goes into, what type of sentencing, the sentencing guidelines to kind of vary. I mean, a lot of factors go into what an individual would receive as far as amount of time in prison. If there's a criminal history, of course, that is taken into consideration at sentencing. But I mean, there's been cases where folks get anywhere from 5 years up to pretty hefty sentences, 20 plus years, life sentences, in many cases. It's going to vary.
And that's regardless of what type of involvement they have in it. Have you had cases where someone was involved, but they weren't like the actual traffickers, but they were kind of forced into participating? Like, that would be, I guess, maybe a different type of legal issue, like if they would have proof that they were forced into participating?
Yeah, there certainly have been cases in where a victim that has been recruited and has been victimized and forced to traffic, whether it be labor or sex trafficking, that is eventually forced to become quote unquote the trafficker. And you see it in many cases. And the hard part becomes, once you get that story, to kind of really, you kind of have to peel back at the layers of that person's experience. Does it make things difficult? Sort of, but at the end of the day, it's all from the perspective of the victim, and it's also the situation that goes on. I've had cases in the past, not necessarily here in El Paso, but in LA, where I was previously stationed, where yeah, it started off with a girl when she was starting to be trafficked. She was maybe 11, 12 years old. And then by the time she's turning 15, 16, she's being forced to recruit other girls. And it's either, unfortunately, do or die. They either do what they're being told to do, or they're going to suffer some sort of consequence. They're horrible and unfortunate situations, but we do see that.
Now, who is usually identified as a human trafficker? We have a tendency to just look at people and say, I'm not sure. So who is identified as, or who is usually identified as a human trafficker?
Sure. I mean, like Aida was saying, it could really be anybody. You have to remember that traffickers are very good at looking for vulnerabilities. They're very good at looking for what that person needs at that particular time. And so there is no cookie cutter of a trafficker is going to look like this, right? Because I've seen literally the gamut. I've seen traffickers that are gang members. I've seen traffickers that look like any grandmother, any mom that you would see. It really does span a variety of looks. And so what I tell people is never assume, because it just might be somebody who you just don't anticipate. I've seen nurses, I've seen different professions. And so it really is, there is no cookie cutter, unfortunately.
What about the victims? Who are the victims and how are they targeted? I know she touched on that a little bit earlier. It could range from some young girls to young ladies.
Sure.
But who are the victims? And I think it was mentioned about young boys too. I recently read somewhere where there was like a 5-year-old, and it was the parent who was actually involved with selling the child. So yeah, who are the victims?
So victims of human trafficking also can be anybody. We've had obviously victims that are incredibly young. My youngest victim when I was investigating was 11 years old. That's not including the very, very young ones. But my oldest victim was in his 60s. And so you have to remember that a victim of human trafficking, there's a vulnerability there and there's a need. And so what these traffickers are looking for is to exploit that vulnerability. So to give you an example, and I saw the look on your face when I said a 60-year-old, well, you have to kind of remember that it involves a business, it involves a labor. So when you have, for example, a carpenter who may not necessarily have status to be in this country, for example, but needs the job, well, maybe they're promised, okay, if you come work for this company as a carpenter, I will pay you X dollar amount, right? And that's what they come thinking that they're going to be working. And the next thing they know, they say, oh, well, no, you're not here legally. Now I'm forcing you to work. You don't have a choice, or I'll turn you over to the authorities. And they don't have a choice, right? So instead of being paid the $15 an hour, now they're being really paid $2 an hour if they're even being paid. Right. And so it's that vulnerability. That person needed the job. When we're talking about sex trafficking and when we're talking about these young girls, I tell people, think back of what you were like when you were in middle school, high school. There was a vulnerability there, right? Every single one of us had something we didn't like, whether it was I'm too tall, I'm too short, I'm too fat, I'm too skinny, I've got curly hair, they've got straight hair. Their emotions, right? Our emotions are kind of topsy-turvy because that's just that time period. These people can exploit that. There's always a need because somebody has that emotional need. And kiddos these days live their lives on the internet. And so it is so easy to see that this kiddo keeps talking about, oh, I wish I had X, Y, and Z, or, putting their emotions out there. And that's enough for that person to get that hook in and say, oh, I think you're the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. Well, that kiddo, that's the emotion that they're looking for. And so that's how that starts. It really starts with that hook. There's also just the financial need or emotional need. Aida was talking about how they're runaways, for example, or if they come from a really difficult family background, they're going to look for that emotional and financial protection. They're going to look for that. And these traffickers are going to take advantage of it.
If I can interject one thing too, another thing to consider, Monica, is that a lot of times these folks are smuggled. And then it turns into human trafficking, where they ask for, I don't know, $1,000 to be smuggled into the country. And once they're here, well, the price goes up. So in order to pay the remaining $4,000, you're going to have to perform this labor that, one, you didn't want to do, you were coerced into doing. So then that becomes a matter of either labor or sex trafficking.
Oh gosh, it's so much. Like I just had another thought, and I wanted to go back to the 60-year-old. I wasn't expecting that. Here I am, 50, thinking nobody's going to want to take me. I think that's probably actually amongst my friends, I'm sure the attitude of most people, like, oh, they don't want, older people. No one's after older people. And just listening, it makes sense now, especially when you talk about the types of trafficking and the reason why. So the awareness, I guess, has to be heightened when it comes to everybody in the community, because when we think, oh, it won't be me, it can actually be you. It can be anyone. So
it really
I'm sorry.
can.
Yes, and Agent Venegas, I think you were going to say something.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the big reasons that we do this community outreach, because it really can be anybody. And it's, again, it all goes back to that vulnerability. If you have a mom, for example, who, especially now in the times of COVID, that it can't make rent, can't make, trying to get food for their kiddo, right? And they post online like, I need a job. Can anybody help me out with blah, 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 with the right intentions, for example, and somebody's going to end up taking advantage of that. And so it's very important to be aware of these things, because unfortunately, there are people who very much need something in the community, and somebody unfortunately takes advantage of that. It almost mirrors domestic violence to a certain degree when you talk about sex trafficking, because of that. It's that relationship, right? And it turns into this romantic relationship, and almost like it looks like a courtship, and then all of a sudden, bam, it changes, and you don't know where that came from. And now you're in this situation where you're emotionally hooked to a certain degree. Something's not right, and you don't even know where to turn.
When it comes to, the victims, besides physical assault, what are the other ways that traffickers instill fear in victims?
Many. So it could be everything from, you talked about the physical force, right? I like to tell people that it's not what you're going to think of with respect to Hollywood. It's not the girl chained to the radiator, right? While that does happen, and I've seen something similar, it could also be the mental, right? So it could also be, if you don't do this, I'm going to kill your family. If you don't do this, I'm going to do something to your kid, right? If you don't do this, I'm going to tell the entire high school what you've been doing. It's that mental cell. And so there are always questions with respect to, well, they weren't locked in a room. Why did they just run away? Well, it's that imaginary cell within that, that they're kind of that fear that's instilled on them. So they have, whether it's that embarrassment, or whether it's that, the shame, whether it's the threat of deportation, especially if the person is not from this country. They may be from a country where you cannot trust law enforcement, right? They may be from a country where they don't have rights. And so the idea that they're going to be turned over to a law enforcement agency that from their perspective is not going to treat them well, right, may do things to them, is very much real. And so those fears are very, very real. And it's enough to keep that person doing what they're going to be doing. And also the fear of, well, yeah, things are really bad, but now who's going to provide for me? I was living on the street, and now instead the pimp, well, now the pimp is providing a hotel room or somewhere to live. So it's that fear also of the unknown, which is why, as Aida mentioned, sometimes they go back to what they know, because that's the only way they know how to survive.
That leads me into my next question about, are the victims always taken, or can they be someone who just leads a regular everyday life, like they're going to school, but like if it's happening, just for instance, if it's happening in our community and someone is being sex trafficked or something, is that possible that they're not always taken? They're just everyday people like us, but they have to be involved in this other part of their life unwillingly. So does that happen?
Yes, absolutely. We have seen it happen where they lead quote unquote normal lives, but there's this other life as well. And so we have seen, girls, for example, that are still going to school, but have, this trafficking situation going on. So does it happen? Absolutely.
I think one other, important aspect to think about nowadays is social media. A lot of times, at best case scenario, it's only a sextortion case where they think that they're chatting with this cute boy, and it turns out to be this, somebody that they didn't even think it was somebody totally different. And in those cases, sometimes they're asked to send nude photos, the kids do, and they're just it's extortion. They're asked to send money, otherwise their photos are going to be exposed. So that's the best case scenario. But in other, more unfortunate circumstances, they're made to get into the sex trade. So I think that's a big part of, even when I grew up, social media was definitely not something that I had. No gaming. I had no, I barely had a computer. So, but now that's another place where people do end up recruiting these individuals, and things have gotten a lot different, especially now with COVID, where we're all inside and our only exposure in some cases is via social media. So that's the only place that people have some human interaction, and that's a good ground to recruit individuals for either human trafficking or for sex trafficking or labor trafficking.
Now that you mentioned social media, I had a family member and I was, concerned because some of the apps, it wasn't, I guess it's considered social media because it's a group of them in these chats, and it required they know your GPS location. You had to have location turned on because it was a type of friend app where you can find friends in your area, and that meant obviously the location had to be on. So does that happen in this area? And have there been issues when it comes to human trafficking, sex trafficking, where they use apps to try to lure kids or anyone else into these situations?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Social media, especially with the location, is a tool that is used by human traffickers. And even kind of dating myself, back when MySpace was available, I don't even know if it's still there, but you have different applications, and they have this way of, you can actually find individuals who are in your area. There'll be sort of an option to say, oh, find new friends in your geolocation, for example. And we've actually seen traffickers use that to try to narrow it down and find somebody within their geographic location, that within 2-mile radius. So we've seen that, which is why we always, try to tell individuals to be safe about social media, make sure the privacy apps, or that it's all, that you make sure that not everything is public, for example, because that is going to be used. That certainly is going to be used. And especially that aunt that tries to look at, my, kiddo's cell phone library. Do you know all of these 3,000 people? Because you never know who's behind that photograph, right? You never know who, if that person that you're trying to talk to is really that person. And now you've got filters and you've got all of this other fancy stuff that it just makes things harder.
Now, does the FBI or any organization have a list of like some of the apps or anything like that that may be used for human or sex trafficking? Well, I guess all of them. I mean, because we're on the main ones like Facebook and Instagram. So I know any can be used for that, but
the FBI does not keep a list of applications and technology that could be used, because it's anything and everything, right? So as humans, we're able to communicate via many methods of technology, but also face to face. And we've even seen trafficking via newspaper. And so now the FBI doesn't track that.
Can you tell us a little bit about the red flags or indicators, as a community, that we should be aware of when it comes to traffickers and victims?
So indicators, victims, it just depends. But in many situations, what we ask individuals to look out for is, can that person walk out on their own? Are they always escorted somewhere? We've found that a large percentage of victims are escorted somewhere and they're not necessarily left alone, especially when you talk about sex trafficking and prostitution. Is that individual allowed to speak for themselves? So we've actually found a certain percentage of victims, about 30% of human trafficking victims, we found actually seek medical aid. What we found is that somebody always escorts them. And so the question is, if somebody is asking them a question, do they look up to see if they can answer? Do they ask the trafficker? Does the trafficker speak for them? You're going to look for indicators of physical indicators. So you're looking for bruises. In some instances, when you're looking at sex trafficking, prostitution, you're looking for tattoos. You're looking for branding, that sort of thing. But nowadays, they've become very smart in that. And so they will leave marks in places that cannot necessarily be seen. So we're looking also for hygiene. We're looking for clothing. We're looking for monetary. We're looking to see if they're well nourished or malnourished. Also indicators of trafficking. And so what I like to tell people is we all have that spidey sense that tells us something's not right. And we always tell people, report it. Well, it may not be a trafficking situation. It might be something where you have a child abuse situation or elder abuse situation. It might be something completely different. But either way, somebody's going to go find out.
Supervisory Special Agent Reyes, is there anything else that, we as a community can do? Or like, I know you gave the what to look for when it comes to traffickers and victims. Is there anything else that we can do as a community to, I guess, bring awareness to it? Like, with, our kids or organizations that we're a part of, like, how can we, bring more awareness to this?
I think one way to stay vigilant, especially for anyone, but I'm thinking more of, the younger folks, just for parents, being a teenager can, it's a change. It's sometimes a difficult time. It's hormonal. So there's a lot of things going on. Kids are looking for their own independence, but for parents, a piece of advice that I would have is just be vigilant about, is your child, your teenager, staying out excessively late, unexplained where they are, associating with an older crowd, maybe dating older men, withdrawal from the family. Maybe they were a great student, an A honor roll student, and suddenly their grades are deteriorating. Those are some things that I would definitely, and of course, making sure, I know it's difficult when you have a teenager to be on top of that social media, but I mean, that's one thing that I would advise parents to be vigilant about with their teenagers. It's a vulnerable age, and it's important to just be aware of what is going on. And for the community in general, if you see something that is out of place or that doesn't make sense, like Agent Venegas was saying right now, if your spidey senses are going off and you think that it's an unusual circumstance or something that is out of place, just report it and let law enforcement look into it. If it is, then it'll be addressed. And if it isn't, well, at least you took the precaution to make sure that you reported the situation.
I guess we just have to stop worrying about if we're wrong, because I think that kind of hinders people from wanting to call or, report something, because, we may feel that maybe I'm looking at it wrong, or this may not be the fact, or you may be getting the family in trouble, and that's not the case or something. So, and I know we're going to be wrapping up here soon, but one of my other questions, had to do with the traffickers and the victims. Is it rare, or is it more often that they may actually know one another? Is it, like if it's family members or friends or something, could it be possible that they have a relationship with the person first?
Sure, absolutely. I've had several cases where the trafficker was actually known to the victim. I had one case specifically that I remember from my time in LA, where it was a family of women who recruited young girls from their village in South America, who they all grew up in the same neighborhood, so they were neighbors, and so parents actually trusted their daughters to these women because they grew up with them, they knew them. And unfortunately, these women had other plans for those young girls. But yes, absolutely. The trafficker can absolutely be known to the victim.
I know we have to wrap up. We can't get a lot done in this little short time, but I do want to be able to bring you both back for different reasons too. Is there anything that you would like to share? Agent Reyes, we can start with you.
Yeah, one thing that I just want to make sure that I mention is there's a hotline for national human trafficking. You can text, you can call. Of course, we have FBI.gov that you can also file a complaint, or your local police department. But I want to make sure that I leave you with the phone number, and that is 1-888-373-7888, or they can text 233-733.
The biggest thing that I'd want to leave you with is, if you see something, say something. At the end of the day, there are victims out there, and I would tell the community, if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. That's what we're here for. We're here to educate our community. We're also here to serve our community. And so if you see something, say something, please report it. It can be reported anonymously as well. So please ask those questions, make those reports, because you might be the person that helps get that person out of that situation.
Thank you both so much for being with us today. And we know that January isn't the only month that we need to be aware of this. So we're going to do our part, whatever it takes, to help share information with the community when it comes to sex and human trafficking. And we want to make sure that the community does report something, even if they think they may be wrong, just to be on the safe side to report it. So we look forward to having you both back with us. So thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.